Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. Tonight we have a very special guest joining us, a Christian author by the name of Bill Mowry. Bill, how are you doing tonight?
Hey, I'm doing fine, Jim. Glad to be here.
It's so good to have you, Bill. Known you for so long, and so excited to talk to you about the latest book you've written. So I think our audience will really enjoy it. But before we do that, maybe just to introduce you to everybody, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself. Maybe start with your testimony. Tell us how you came to Christ.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I like to tell people, Jim, that, and I realize this dates me. I usually tell people I'm a veteran staff person with the Navigators.
Okay.
And by veteran, it means I've just been around for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But so I like to say that when I started college in the late 1960s, I was giving my life to the three R's: revolution, rock and roll, and romance. And so, classic 60s guy. And somewhere in high school, I told God to shove off and didn't want any part of him and didn't want any part of his Bible. And in fact, my dad had become a believer in his early 40s, probably when I was about a sophomore in high school. And he'd take me to these gospel meetings. And I finally said, Dad, I don't want any part of this. And he said, well, what's it going to take, Bill, for you to read the Bible? And I said, well, I will read the Bible if you read this book. And he says, well, what's the book you want me to read? And I said, it's the autobiography of Malcolm X. And he never read that, and I never read the Bible. But
so that didn't quite work out.
And so when I got into college, I got involved with the Students for a Democratic Society, protested the Vietnam War, struck classes, all that kind of stuff. But in my freshman dorm in college, it's at Bowling Green State University, I got to be good friends with a guy named Ed, and Ed and I shared a number of common interests: history and music and girls, and history and music and girls. But there's one thing we didn't have in common, and that was Ed was a Christ follower. And I had never met anybody my own age who not only claimed to be a Christian, but really tried to live the Christian life. And that caught my attention with Ed. And so we just had numerous conversations, and to kind of make a long story short, the summer between my freshman and sophomore year, I went home and I thought, I'm going to read the Gospels this summer. I never, I'd had the Bible read to me and at me, but I never read it myself. And so I read through the Gospels, and I thought there's something compelling about this man, Jesus. And I couldn't his words kind of lingered. I couldn't contradict him. There's a truthfulness about his life and what he taught. And I'd been through enough gospel meetings with my dad to know about the importance of placing my faith in Christ and how he died for my sins. So I knew all those basic things. And when I went back to college, my sophomore year, I met another friend of mine that, from my freshman year, connected in the dorm, and I noticed that his life had changed. And, his language had cleared up, and a lot of the magazines he was looking at, he tossed out. And I said, Joel, what happened? Your life's different. And he said, well, last spring, I invited Christ into my life. And it struck me because I thought, if Joel's life could change, maybe Jesus could change my life.
Oh, wow.
It was in late October of my sophomore year. So this dates me. This is 1969. I actually did the classic thing, knelt down by my bed in the dorm room. I was by myself, and I can't remember exactly what I prayed, but, the essence of placing your trust in Christ and asking for forgiveness. And it's not like, I heard angels sing and it wasn't a bolt of lightning. But over a couple of weeks, I noticed I think some things are happening. And I thought, I wonder if I've become a Christian now. So I found my friend Ed again, and I went down to his dorm and I said, hey, Ed, I think I've become a Christian. And I said, but how do I know for sure? And he says, well, are you reading the Bible now? And I says, yeah. And he says that, are you praying now? And I says, yeah. And he says, have you ever done this before? And I said, no. And he said, well, that's probably a pretty good sign that something's happened. And then he asked me this question, Jim, and I like to refer to this as a life-changing question. He said, hey, Bill, how about tomorrow after class, we meet in the study lounge and we read the Bible together. And that started this pattern of us reading the Bible together kind of every week. And so in that process, and again, Ed's just a regular guy, just like me, and same age, and so he wasn't this super athlete or anything, just a regular guy. And so over that time together, he taught me how to spend time with God in a quiet time. We memorized scripture together, taught me how to share my faith. And so, he discipled me, and I didn't really know that much about what was taking place. I just figured, hey, this is just what Christians do. And I discovered later that I think we met on Wednesday or Thursday, and on Mondays, Ed was meeting with the Navigator staff guy. And so in a sense, Ed was passing on to me what the Navigator staff guy was passing on to Ed. And that's really how I got involved with the Navigators. That Ed invited me then to this campus ministry, to this fellowship. And so, as I like to say, that so that the revolution was replaced by seeing that, boy, only the gospel can really transform people's lives in real, lasting ways. And instead of a rock and roll culture, I inherited Jesus's culture. And instead of being madly in love with a girl who I later ended up marrying, and God replaced it with a new love for Him. And so, but that's how I came to faith, and that's how I first got involved with the Navigators, and that's how I got my first taste for disciple making. It was all within about that 1 year period or so.
So now you mentioned the Navigators a couple of times, just for listeners that might not be familiar with the Navigators at all.
Sure.
Just describe the organization, because that's how I met you. And I'll talk in a second about how you and I came to know each other in a minute. But just tell people about the Navigators, and then maybe you could segue into what the organization is, and then how you became involved with them and your role with them.
Sure. Yeah, good question. The Navigators, we would say, is a non-denominational Christian organization. And I think our simple theme explains a lot, it's to know Christ and to make Him known, and then to help others do the same. And so that, Dawson Trotman, who was a founder of the Navigators, came to faith in the 1930s. And it's a long story, but he began a ministry among servicemen on the West Coast. And by the end of World War II, there were men trained by the Navigators, I think, on almost every ship in the U.S. Navy at that time. And Dawson's emphasis was, he called it follow-up, and today we call it discipleship. But how do you come alongside of somebody and help them be a wholehearted follower of Jesus, and men and women who are practicing some basics in the Christian life, that they're people engaged with the scriptures, or people who are praying, people that are having quality friendship and fellowship with others, and the people who know how to share their faith, and that there's this focus on obedience and application. And so it's kind of helping men and women do that, and then in such a way they can then help others do that. And so this movement of the Navigators began in the Navy, kind of spread to the college campuses, and of course, as men, and women, left the campus, went into, marketplace settings, whole variety of places. What I do is I work with churches and with pastors and helping them build intentional disciple-making churches. And so that's kind of a little bit of the Navigators. We have several, I don't know, maybe 1,000 staff around over 100 countries in the world, and ministering among, the military bases, college campuses, in the marketplace, in churches, in what we call the nations, at home, that is, refugees and so on here in the U.S. from a variety of nations, as well as a ministry overseas. So that's kind of a capture of the Navigators. And so I'm on full-time staff with them, and have been for 50 years now, and then investing with churches and pastors.
50 years, is that right?
Yeah, that is right. No, that's a long time.
So I should, it's
Well, I came on staff when I was 15, Jim.
Exactly. Well, that's how you and I met. So when I went to Ohio State, and by the way, let me just connect some dots for our listeners. So when Greg and I post recordings of a Bible study, we always refer to a Bible study that we're involved with, where we're speakers at this Bible study. It's not a small group Bible study with 6 people around a table. It's like 50 people in a room. And Greg will give a talk, and then we'll post it on this this podcast, and I'll give a talk. We'll post on this podcast. That Bible study itself is a Navigator Bible study. So it's a lot of our material for this podcast. But you and I met because when I went to Ohio State as a freshman, I got involved in Navigators as well, and you were my I would say my NAV rep, which stands for
Yeah.
Navigators representative, because you were the representative working at Ohio State. And that's how you and I got to know each other. And then I like to say, fast forward, my wife and I met at Ohio State. You officiated at our wedding as well. So
Yes.
really
Yeah.
appreciate that still. And so we have quite a connection. And I would say very instrumental in my discipleship and my Christian life. So I appreciate all that, Bill. I really do.
Well, thanks, Jim. As I did, a month or so ago, I did apologize for. It's kind of like, and yeah, it's as you go along in life, you learn things, and in the lessons you learn, you think, oh, I wish I would have done more of that or
Oh,
less
yeah.
of that back then. And so I feel like, it's just been a privilege to catch up with kind of quote unquote alumni like you, and to see what you're doing and how God's using your life. And by the way, I've been using your statement about the most important question is the second question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. In fact, it's on my blog
I
post
think
this
I got
week,
that.
Jim.
This is circular. I think I got that from you, Bill. So I remember you, yeah, and it's in your book. So we're going to get to that. But this, as they could be a good question asker and asking two questions in a row, ask
Yeah.
the second question, teaching my kids that, so I was chatting with someone today who I said, what are you doing? He said, oh, I was at this fundraiser. I could have said, oh, that's nice. And so the
Yeah.
next one was, what was the fundraiser for?
Yes.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
disabled children. So I think I'm practicing a Bill Mowry.
Yeah, but you stated it, I thought, in a captivating way, Jim, that the most important question is the second question.
That's
And I
right.
thought that's a good, memorable statement that anybody can apply in any setting.
Yeah.
So those are the things that I love hearing and love capturing is, how do you create those kind of statements that are memorable to people and really capture an essence of truth and practicality?
Yeah. And there's things like that I remember, Bill, from your influence. And some of them end up showing up in this book. I don't want to jump too far ahead because I want to give a little bit of context to the readers about the book. And there was one thing in there, Bill, about a leader. It might have been the Ed you're talking about, but who just on a Sunday afternoon was just reading Philippians.
Oh, okay.
I
No,
love that story. And I don't want,
yeah.
again, you'll give readers the title of the book and the context in a second here, but I just love that because
Yeah.
it was almost like you're saying, so why are you reading Philippians? And you didn't say this in the book, but I could imagine this conversation. Like, are you preparing for a Bible study? Are you going to teach on it? Are you leading
No,
something? Nope.
no, he's a physician friend of mine.
Yeah.
And Bill, and he's actually been like a mentor to me over the years. He's 83 years old himself.
Okay.
So, and not that I'm 83, but Bill's 83. And he's just, I think, wow, Bill, just one afternoon, he kind of said, I'm just going to go through the book of Philippians. And he's describing how God met him in the book of Philippians. And for a large number of years, he didn't watch TV. And he's married, and he's a fanatic cyclist. I don't know how many hundreds of miles he bicycles every month,
Wow. Wow.
But Bill has this just an infectious love for God, and just a very a joy. His key word is joy, and how do we bring joy? He's a researcher. He's an endocrinologist and a researcher at the Ohio State University Medical Center, and he spent his life studying the impact of stress on aging. And that would be another whole topic altogether.
Oh yeah.
And I've just learned so much from him. And part of it is you just appreciate his life. This is a real thing. This is a real deal for Bill. And to me, that's part of the older I get, and discipling people and investing in people's lives, you begin to realize how everybody has this unique story of how God's worked in their life.
Yeah.
Then the privilege, when you get involved with people, you realize I probably learn more from others than I hope in any way I might pass on to them. And so that it's just we get enriched, like our lunch, a couple of months ago. I still remember, and that statement, second most important. And so I walked away enriched by that. And that's part of the privilege, I think, of investing in people's lives.
Well, that story, when you wrote that, and I read in your book about, the guy the mentor figure who's just reading the Bible on a Sunday afternoon because he loves to read the Bible. I remember when I was in college and you said to me once, Jim, what do you read in your spare time? And I mentioned some things I was reading. He said, Jason, you really encouraged me. Just pick up the Bible and read it. Just read
Yeah.
it. Just read the Bible. Just,
Yeah.
great wisdom. So let's talk about the book. And so
Sure.
the book is called The Ways of the Leader, but this is not your first book, right? You've had a number of books published, right?
No, I had two books prior to that. One was on Nav Press called The Ways of the Alongsider, How to Disciple People Life to Life. And that's really kind of like a field guide, a training manual for relational disciple making.
Mm.
And that there are certain ways that should characterize how we disciple people. And again, the focus on it is that I guess one of my passions in life, Jim, is how do we deprofessionalize and, in a sense, simplify the Great Commission so that everyday Christian feels I could have a part in doing this.
Really?
So that's what I've tried to do with first with the Ways Alongside or on Nap Press. The second one is on Moody on Walk With Me, basic principles for everyday disciple making. And so the second one is more of a book. The first book is like a Bible study. Second one, I call it a book, something you read, but it's kind of capturing, in some ways, it's capturing stuff I wish I would have learned, 30 years ago
Yeah.
and about disciple making. But again, it's my whole goal is, how do we take disciple making out of the realm of the ministry professional, like a navigator
Yeah.
staff person, whatever, staff person in a church, whatever it is, that, hey, it's meant for everyday people like you and me to be able to disciple others.
It sounds so common sense. It sounds so real. It sounds so biblical. Like,
Yes.
and there's
Yeah.
so much of that's the model, right? Spiritual
Yeah.
multiplication. But just, I will tell you, I mean, just this week, Deb and I were talking about a church that was saying, here, the basic model is, let me tell you how you can bring your friends to church.
Yes.
And here the professionals preach. And so the whole push is get them into the building
Yes.
so they can hear from professionals like me, train people,
Yes.
because you obviously, and not even a hint that I want to help train you to do this with your
Right.
neighbors, because you'll
Right.
they didn't say this, and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but the implication is you'll never get it right. You'll
Yeah.
never be able to do it. What's the point? Don't
Yes.
bother. Just bring them to me, and I will.
Yes.
The trained professional will take it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you say it, and I think in especially the Navigators are all about that spiritual implication. It
Yes.
seems so obvious, but in so many circles, it's not so obvious. They're
Yes.
they're in the trained professional model.
I know, and and that's what carried over into the book and the Ways of the Leader. That again,
Mm.
that I'm writing it for kind of what I call the everyday leader. This is a leader who doesn't have the corner office. He or she doesn't have multiple staff. They don't have a big research budget. They could be a pastor of a church of 2 to 3, 400 people.
Mhm.
They could be kind of like a neighborhood activist. They could be working with a parachurch ministry in some form. And but it's, again, my goal there is to I call it's easy to rely on. I call them intellectual mercenaries. And that, mercenaries, I'm paying somebody else to fight for me.
Oh, right.
Sometimes, and particularly in leadership, that we pay other people to think for us.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's by, we invite the best-selling author in, we go to the seminar, and we spend all this money on things.
Yeah.
And in a sense, we're asking other people to think for us as leaders. So my premise is, well, as leaders, usually local leaders are facing local challenges and they need to come up with local solutions or strategies. And anymore, we're realizing that one size doesn't fit all. And that so often when you have an expert come in, they're an expert perhaps in a procedure or in a place, but that may not describe my place and my
Yeah.
people and my issues. And so
Yeah.
then how do we give some basic skills for local leaders to solve the problems in a sense with the Lord and for themselves? Because local leaders know what's best for their local places and the local challenges they're facing. So the whole goal of this book is, hey, here's some tools in a sense for you to pursue the Lord and to practice some ways that will help you to come up with, as a local leader, local solutions for your local challenges. Because those are different than my challenges.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that speaks in the premise of the book. The major premise has all wrapped around wisdom.
Yes. Yes.
You know what? So we'll get to that in a second. But just to be clear for the audience, the book is titled The Ways of the Leader by Bill Mowry. Mowry, in case anyone's wondering, listening on audio. The subtitle is Four Practices to Bring People Together and Break New Ground, published by Nav Press. When was this published, Bill? Is it
I think it was about a year and a half ago.
okay? About a year and a half
Yeah.
ago. Okay. And then you just recently were invited to come to Africa.
Yes. Yeah. We were invited by the African Navigator leadership to come and spend a day, yeah, teaching on the principles of this book.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So it's reaching people and it's getting a response. So
Yes. Yes.
uh so that's great. So the book, just let's think about big picture. It's based on an illustration where wisdom is at the center. Maybe you want to
Yes.
describe that for people who are listening to us on audio right now.
Yeah. So that wisdom is the center. And let me do two things. One is maybe describe the need and why wisdom is needed. And so picture yourself. I'm not a tennis player, but my friends who are tennis players, they tell me about practicing and they go on the court and they load up the ball machine, right? That's going to pitch the tennis ball at you. And so you're sitting in your tennis stance and they throw that first ball at you and you whack it over the net. And then before you have a chance to reset, another ball comes at you. And you barely got time to hit that ball. Then another one comes at you, and then another one comes at you. And so these balls then flying at you, and you don't have time to reset. So you're madly scrambling. And for a lot of leaders, that's what life is like today. That we're just facing unprecedented challenges to leadership in a whole variety of ways. And we don't know a lot of times what to do. That there's not, this exact solution out there or one size fits all, the silver bullet idea. And so what we need is God's wisdom to, like I said earlier, as a local leader, we need God's wisdom to come up with local solutions for local challenges. And I like to think of wisdom. This is what's really helped me, Jim, as we look at the biblical picture of wisdom, that wisdom, I see it as wisdom is a skill to choose what is good and what is right. And so, like the word skill, wisdom, particularly in the book of Proverbs, can be translated as skill.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it this way, that you've, as a person in the financial industry, you develop certain skills about reading financial indexes, dealing with banks and so on. And with those skills have come wisdom. That's what people pay you to do. In a sense, they're asking for your wisdom on how to make choices. And that wisdom has come because you've developed some skills. And so in one sense, one way of defining wisdom is it's skillful living before the Lord. And so wisdom is a skill to choose what is good and what's right. And by good being, this is the goodness of God. And in the goodness of God, he wants to give people life and he wants to see people flourish.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to make wise decisions that help people, that gives people life and then helps them flourish. And so wisdom is the skill to choose what's good and then what's right. And so wisdom biblically is tied up in the righteousness of God. There's a rightness about it. There's a justice about it. There's a fairness about it. And so I want to make decisions then that are just and right for people. And sometimes those are hard decisions and, or hard standards, but they're coupled with the good.
Yeah.
Again, another way of picturing it, Jesus says that, in John 1, that he's full of grace and truth. And that's another way of picturing this, that, it's like with our children, that we want to have wisdom and how can we help them to choose what's good, what's going to give them life, it's going to help
Right.
them flourish, but also what's just, what's the right thing to do, what's the fair, the just thing to do. And
Yeah.
so that's, it's kind of, wisdom is that ability to have insight and understanding to kind of see through all the fog and say, well, Lord, in this setting, at this time, in this place, what's a wise thing to do? And so that's the premise of the book. And then as I talk about this kind of four practices, or I call them ways, that helps to grow that wisdom. It's kind of like seeing wisdom. You've got a wisdom bank. And again, you're a banker, you'd understand this. So how do I continue to add to the amount of wisdom that's stored in my bank? And here's four ways so you can add to that wisdom bank to allow your wisdom to grow.
Yeah. So before we get to the four ways, just I was thinking this as I was reading your book. I'm a big, huge fan of Tim Keller, and
Yes.
Keller had a great sermon series. Gosh, he probably preached in the late 90s, but it's available. Everything's available online for free. but a whole series on Proverbs.
Okay.
And he just picked out different Proverbs and just thematically went through it. And the big point he was trying to make is that wisdom is first of all, the Bible's got rules, absolutely, 10 commandments and a whole bunch of other rules, right? But wisdom is for the 99% of life for which the rules don't apply.
Yes.
And I love the way you connect it to being a leader, because you say, look, and I'm glad you brought up the tennis ball analogy, because that's how you start the book, and right, it grabs you right there, and then it never lets you go, right? So that's what I felt like you're exactly right. These tennis balls come at you, different decisions you have to make come at you, life comes at you, different situations come at you. So you can't just read a book that says, here's how to be a leader, do ABC. It's a cookie cutter approach, you'll be fine. And you can, or take this program to get this MBA, learn how to be a leader, and you'll be fine. No, you need wisdom to be a leader. You make decisions on the fly, because it's for the 99% of life for which the rules don't help you.
Yeah.
So that's great. What prompted you to start the book in the first place? Is this something that's been on your mind since you wrote the other book?
Yes. No, this is something, I guess, that a number of these themes, being a lifelong learner is one of the themes in there, being in ministry, a culture detective, ministry innovator, and a collaborative leader. These are themes, I guess, in ways that I've become convinced of over the years that are necessary for good leadership. And so I've just tried to apply those in a variety of kind of ministry settings. Because again, we're always thinking, how do you prepare leaders for the future? And you think about it, if you can help leaders just to be able to learn from life, if you can help leaders understand their context or their culture, helping leaders to see that there's wisdom in the community, how do I pull people together in a collaborative way? And then to say, boy, in a lot of cases, we need to do some innovative thinking, some fresh approaches. And how do you help people think innovatively?
Yeah.
The innovation is drawn from, understand the context, the culture around me. It's relevant to that. It's drawn from the wisdom in the community, and it's drawn from my learning experiences. And again, all that's wrapped up in the idea of wisdom. And so wisdom, it's not being innovative for innovative sake, but it's applying wisdom and saying, well, Lord, let me give you an eye. Can I go off on two little tangents here?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah. And then you could ask me about them. But one of the ideas of wisdom that we talk about, the Bible is very clear that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Right.
And I've thought about that. Okay, so what does that mean? And
Right.
I thought, and again, the classic definition of fear is a sense of reverence and awe. It's not fear in that I'm afraid of you, but it's fear in a sense of reverence and awe. And I think of it as coming up to the Grand Canyon. And if you ever seen the Grand Canyon, when my boys were little, we saw every major canyon in Colorado, and there's a mini Grand Canyon in Colorado, and we'd always take these boys, my boys there in middle school, and maybe your kids were like this, particularly the boys. You get up to the guardrail, right, and you're looking over, and they pretend to push each other over. Boys just do that. And my wife Peggy kind of grab them. I said, "Oh, they're just being boys." But you're looking at that canyon, whether it's a Grand Canyon or another one, and it's kind of like you're drawn in to get closer to it, right? Because it's so majestic and beautiful. And it's like you want to reach out and grab it, and you bend over and you look at it, and then you look down and you realize, wow, this is a long way down there. And it's almost like we automatically take a step back. Whether we do or not, there's like this reflex, take a step back, because I've come into contact with something bigger and more majestic and beautiful than I am. I'm so in awe of it, I kind of take a step back. And to me, that's the fear of the Lord. There's this majesty and a beauty about him, and I want to grab it all, but then I realize, oh, he's really different for me. And I take a step back, because when I realize in the fear of the Lord, it shows me how small I am in comparison to him. And that smallness, that I stand small before a big God.
Yeah.
There's a practical application of this, and it's a story told about Dawson Trotman. And when Trotman got converted in his early 20s, he got, like most guys, most young guys, right? They're eager for ministry. Where do they get involved at? Youth ministry, right? You were involved in youth ministry. Hey, he's a cool guy. Let's give him the high school kids. And so we give him the high school kids. And Dawson tells the story about these kids are just running all over him. He had no control, didn't know what to do. And he's in desperation. And this is recorded in his biography. He says that, Lord, you made little boys give me an idea, and how God gave him some ideas. And I thought, that's wisdom, is I realized, Lord, you made little boys. I'm standing
Hmm.
small in front of God.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
made little boys. Now give me an idea.
Hmm.
And he's seeking wisdom on how to do that. And it's that spirit that we want to have in all of these kind of what I call the four ways, is that we're realizing, yeah, I'm kind of standing small before big God. Lord, you made little boys. He's the creator. Now give me an idea. And I'm waiting
Yeah.
on him to give me ideas. And here are four channels or four ways that can be, ways that he's going to give us ideas to kind of
Yeah.
get that challenge over the tennis net that he's throwing at me. So I kind of took a little sidetrack here, but I think that boy, it helped me to. The other thing, Jim, is I realized my own sense of arrogance over the years in writing this book that I hadn't realized before.
Really?
That yeah, I look back on when I first came on staff, the Navigators. I had what was we then called them state directors, and this friend of mine, John Ed Robertson, would come and visit me probably about twice a year, come up to Bowling Green State University. And I look back on it and I realized I can never remember asking him a question. Yeah, a lot of questions.
Or the
But
second one, let alone
yeah,
the second
he
one.
never, but I never asked him, and I thought, why didn't I do that? Because I felt I knew it all. I
Yeah,
didn't,
it's funny.
I had this arrogance, and I
Yeah.
realized that that's been a part of my life for a lot of years, and I
Well,
wasn't standing small before this big God, and what I found in writing is a lot of ways. Every book that I've written, I can look at this major lesson that God taught me through writing this book of what I realized about myself and what I realized about him.
in the process of
Ways.
writing, in the
In the
process,
process of writing, every book's
it's
taught
not
me.
like I got this great lesson God taught me, therefore I want to write a book. But actually, in the process of writing, this was
I learned something. Yeah,
wow.
of course, you start out writing
Yeah.
from what you've experienced and
Yeah.
there's things you've gathered, but then I realized, wow, yeah, God really taught me something through writing this book that I hadn't realized about my life before. Because I
Yeah.
think I think that particularly in writing nonfiction, the type of nonfiction I do, and to some degree that you do, is a lot of it, and very much so with your book, Jim. I call it biographical wisdom. That is, it's wisdom that's drawn from kind of the biography of our lives. We're extracting what God's done in the course of in the book of our lives, and so it's not, in a sense, theoretical. We're not trying to write a commentary in the Gospel of John. Other
Mhm.
people are skilled in doing that,
That's right. That's right.
and that's a needed form of writing. But a lot of what both you and I do is, well, we're capturing lessons that God's taught us in our life, and we want to write them in ways because we think, if I learned them and they've been helpful for me, maybe they can be helpful for somebody else.
Yeah.
And I'm a
Yeah.
steward of that experience, of that wisdom, and I want to pass it on. And maybe other people can be helped through my experience.
Right. And my failures, right? So
Yes, yes,
things that took me, I feel like things that took me years to figure
yes,
out.
yes,
Like, can I help you with that? You can learn it. You can avoid all this pain,
yes,
and get things in a few minutes if we could just have a good conversation. And then that took me years to come up with. And I love what you were just saying, just to not leave it so quickly. That tension between humility with Dawson saying, "You made little boys, help me to figure this out." Humility and arrogance. And I think as leaders, especially if you're given leadership young and early, and
yes.
especially if you don't have checks on that,
Mhm.
so um and in the business world, if a lot of people say I want to be an entrepreneur, run my own company, some of that, if you do that, you can get to a place where you haven't had someone give you a performance review for years,
Yeah, yeah,
and someone say, "Hey, you got some real problems. You gotta fix this. I'm frustrated with you. You got to
yes,
change."
yes,
If you can get yourself in a situation where and by the way, entrepreneurs aren't the only ones who are in that situation. Other people get in their roles like that in life too. Um, then all these things, these errors in your life can go unabated for a long time.
yes, yes,
And sometimes then God has to come and do a real corrective surgery
yes,
to kind of snap you
yes.
back.
But a couple of years ago, I did a little study in the pastoral epistles. Okay, First, Second Timothy, and
Yeah,
Titus.
yeah,
And those are the three New Testament books that talk about the qualities of leadership in the local church,
Yeah.
whether it's with a deacon or an elder. And I listed between the three books as 44 qualities. Now,
Oh,
again, some
wow.
of those overlap, okay? And so it's not like 44 distinct ones, it was 44 words. And out of those 44, only two of those deal with competencies.
Oh, really?
In terms of leadership, you have to be able to teach the word well, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And manage God's household well.
Hmm.
The rest of it is all character. In other
Wow.
words, out of those 42 qualities, only two deal with competencies or skills that we need to have. The
Mm.
rest is our character. And even those competencies or skills are always ministered through the lens of the character of who we are.
Yeah.
That character is really critical in God's eyes. And
Yeah.
that's that, spirit of wisdom again, that, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. And so again, that idea that, hey, I stand pretty small before this great God, and that keeps me humble,
Yeah.
that places a focus on character rather than my abilities to do things.
Well, yeah. And I love the idea that you're saying, even in writing the book, you're learning things as you're writing it. Because you could say, I'm the author, I'm the teacher, I'm share with you
Yeah.
some of the wisdom I've got. Like,
Yes. Yeah.
but the humility of saying, I learned things about myself confessionally, even as I'm
Yes.
writing this. That's the whole idea. And it's in your book about being a lifelong learner, which is it's actually so tied up with the Navigators and the whole idea of discipleship. And I think about, my own family connections with my father-in-law, mother-in-law, and staff, the Navigators,
Yeah.
just great examples of being lifelong learners
Yeah.
as a key element. But I don't want to lose this train of thought on what you just talked about experiential learning and observations, because I loved, and one of the big things I flagged to talk to you about, that you were quoting from Proverbs 24.
Oh, yeah.
I've said, if my kids listen to this podcast, they'll recognize, because I quoted this to them so many times,
Really?
and I thought about this passage since I was in high
Yeah.
school, before you and I met, Bill, just and for the exact notion you bring it up, which is it's observational wisdom. He says,
Yes.
I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. This is Proverbs 24, verses 30 to 34. The ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man.
Yeah.
It's observational
Yes.
wisdom. And that, I mean, you call it, it's in your heading is a pathway for lifelong learning.
Yes.
I love, like I said, my kids all start laughing as they listen to this. So I say, yeah, that's one Dad quotes to us all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But someone just like looking at life and observing it and
Yes.
gaining wisdom from that.
Yes. And that is a radical idea in the sense of that our culture does not encourage us to stop, because you have the sense in that passage that he's stopping, because he says, I
Loitering.
considered what I saw, which means I'm stopping to explore it.
Right.
And our culture wants to move us on,
Yeah.
and everything in our culture is built for speed.
Yeah.
And there's been documentation and well, it's an excellent book by Carr on the Shallows by Michael Carr, and he's done extensive research. He's not an old curmudgeon like me, but he's a guy that regularly uses social media, heavily engaged in it. But he's saying the bottom line of social media is that it is teaching people, it's teaching people to keep moving fast so that they cannot slow down and to think in deep ways. It's robbing people of the ability to pay attention and to think deeply. And so that now again, he's documenting this from research, etc. He's just not an old guy that's complaining about stuff.
Yeah.
And there is research. We were talking earlier about the Atlantic Monthly, and they had an article there several years ago on again, the algorithms that's used in all of your major websites. And it's feeding upon everybody's curiosity, insatiable for the next new thing. And so I mean, they have built the algorithms that built the slot machines in Las Vegas have been the same ones that built social media. And
is that right?
yes, and it is, and so it's sucking us in, and so that we don't stop to think. And so that stopping to think is becoming more and more of a countercultural experience. I mean, they had a major article, boy, was it in the New York Times last week about teachers lamenting the ability to assign college students the ability to read books in college. They can't assign students to read books.
Because they won't sit long enough to
They
read
won't
through.
sit long enough to pay attention to it. And that what it's like on my blog, I asked the guy who helped me to develop it, and I said, well, should I be concerned about how long it is? He says, no, you don't be concerned about length because people are only going to skim it and
Yeah.
they're only going to look for the highlighted portions.
What's that?
It can be as long as you want.
Yeah, right.
They skim it. Now I'm getting off track, but the point is that to be a lifelong learner means that I need to stop and slow down and think
Yeah.
about what am I learning? Like our conversation a couple of months ago in that restaurant where you made
Yeah.
that statement about, or the most important question is the second question. I've been thinking about that for 2 months now. I thought it's a great way of stating it. But see, it's stopping and thinking about a conversation I had with somebody and what can I learn from that conversation instead of going on to the next conversation and the next and the next. And so lifelong learners stop and think about those conversations. Not everyone, but there are significant ones that often happen in a day or maybe in a week, and maybe it's with my spouse, coworker, whatever it might be, that it's kind of like the Spirit of God catches my attention and I need to say, I'm going to stop and think about that,
Yeah.
see what I can learn. What's a lesson that God has for me in this?
I think in the book you use the word loitering, right? It's loitering.
Yes.
And I'll tell you,
Yes.
when I read that in our company, we have, a lot of times we have meetings to talk about things. And all the younger people sometimes say, this is a waste of time. Why are we meeting all the time?
Yeah.
And a couple of us in the leadership positions, as a woman, the president of our bank, she says, look, this is, and she coined this term, very consistent with her concept of loitering. She says, this is the lazy river of management. We need to have these conversations.
Yeah.
We need to have slow, quiet conversations where we dwell on things. You just mull over things, chew on things, and take the time. And it's a message almost to say, I know it's frustrating for you. You think, you got to get your other work done. This committee, why am I on this committee or why am I on this meeting? But this is how we move forward.
Yes.
Lazy river of thought, which is I wrote in the margin as I was reading your book, like when you talk about loitering, that's the same idea. Like and I could see it. This the my kids talk about doom scrolling on TikTok or Instagram, one video to the next, and it's you're right. It's trains a way of thought.
That's a great word picture. I'm going to steal that one. The lazy river of thought is
lazy river of thought. Yes, it's great. It's great.
It's a great word picture. Yeah, and we need some of those.
Yeah,
before the rapids hit.
Yeah, it's like when we had dinner together, lunch and turn into dinner like a couple hours. It's a lazy river of thought of spending time that way, and our culture doesn't allow for a lot of that. And it's a challenge in leadership. There's all those tennis balls coming at you so quick.
Yes,
you can't pause to think and get a grip. So anyway, so let me just say that the diagram, the main diagram of the book, you have wisdom in the center, lifelong learning. We've been talking about that at the top of the 12 o'clock position. And then at 3 o'clock, there's collaboration, working with others. That's a little bit of lazy river. We're already touching on some of these things. At the 6 o'clock position, you've got cultural wisdom. Want to talk about that. And then the left side, you have innovation. Oh, before we get to cultural wisdom, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I think I'm wondering if I'm in this book, because on the chapter on innovation, you talk about someone who gave you an NCR computer, and my brother gave her NCR at the time, and then someone else who showed up with a Mac, an early Apple Mac, and I had an early Apple Mac, and I remember working on that. And I'm wondering if I'm the guy, or maybe I'm not. Maybe it's somebody else.
No, you're not. But I use you in another illustration, Jim. Only it's not in the book.
Okay.
Well, I just thought this was one of the most innovative things. When we were in campus ministry, we sponsored a dinner theater. And you and Gary, I forget,
Gary Baldoff. I remember this one. Yeah.
And you guys put together that little 2-person dialogue. And I thought I still remember this thing.
You remember it better than I do when you were telling me about it again.
I know. And do you want me to? Or
yeah, sure.
Well, you were two best friends in college and you decide to meet every year after college. Well, I think maybe every couple of years, but anyhow, you set up a regular time to meet. And so, the little 2-act play was, you meet the first couple of years, everything's going okay. Meet the next couple of years, and one of the guys said that, boy, I've had some test results, just haven't been feeling well. And the next couple of years, you come back again. Now, again, this is in the 1980s.
Yeah.
What was a big health issue in the 1980s? It was
AIDS.
AIDS.
Right.
And so about the third or fourth time, the one guy comes back, and I think it was you, says, well, I found out I have AIDS. I caught it through a blood transfusion. And you talk about this, and the next scene is, well, you don't show up. And I thought, what a dramatic, and then it's kind of, okay, how do we weave the gospel into what just happened here?
Yeah.
And I thought that was such a creative way without being overly sentimental or magnifying it out of proportion. You know what I mean? That
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it was is because I could picture two friends doing this and meeting, and I thought, what a creative way to bring the gospel into a setting. And so that's that spirit of innovation and this is what's really helped me. And actually, Steve Jobs was really helpful on this because Jobs talked about he wants to take the function of a computer and he says, how do you marry aesthetics, something beautiful, to function, what something does? And so that, I think oftentimes in the church, we stay with the same function, like worship service. We just stay, okay, we got a function, it's to meet with God, worship Him, praise, etc., etc. But the form can change at times. And what we don't want to do is change the forms. And so we get stuck, we get married to a certain form. And or the other thing that happens is so change everything, we would toss out the original function of it. But I think as Christians, we need to be thinking about, boy, we have an established biblical function, as it were, goal, vision, whatever, but that can take a variety of forms. How do we
Yeah.
marry something beautiful, which God wants to do? Think about it. He could have created an entirely brown world. He could have created
Right.
a brown world. Everything looks the same. He could have created you and me as everybody looks the same.
Yeah.
But it created us without scent. We can't smell anything. He could have
Right.
created us without taste buds, but we got something like 10,000 taste buds to sample things with. He could have done that, but he didn't. He gave us taste buds, he gave us beauty, gave us color. And so it tells us something about the creator. Why don't we bring those things how do we marry the aesthetics of the creator to the functions that we do in ministry? And I realize I'm going off here a little bit, but that's a thrust of that chapter. And I think a lot
Yeah.
of times, quite frankly, I think the church kind of lives in 1950s black and white TV when we could
Mm-hmm.
be living in a high definition flat screen TV.
Well, I love that. I think there are people think of innovative ways to reach people for Christ, innovative ways to teach the gospel while still staying true to the core truths of
Yes.
the word,
Yes.
right? So not sacrificing, not going into error or heresy, but really
Yes.
but saying the ways you reached people, you know, 20, 30 years ago, just maybe not going to
Yes.
work the same
Yeah.
today. But there was a part in that chapter you talked about surrender. And I really like that.
Yes. Yes.
This
Yeah.
idea to be innovative. I think let me see if I got it, Bill. This is the idea that if you want to be innovative, you've got to be willing to kind of surrender your desire for control or your desire to be, I'm in charge, I'm the leader, I know best. This notion of
Yes.
subjugating your ego and
Yes.
or pride to say, I need others and I can really learn from others.
Yes.
Opens
Well,
it up.
I think that's a little bit more, Jim, in the chapter on um collaboration
Oh,
because
I thought, okay. Yes,
yeah,
that makes
because
sense. But yeah.
because I think what I've seen in collaboration is we usually end up either coordination or cooperation, as I call it. Collaboration, to me, is the idea that I'm facing a challenge so big, I don't know what's the best way to go about this. So I need to
Hmm.
bring others in, and together we come up with something. And so, in one sense, we start with a blank piece of paper. And then we trust in Romans 4:17, describing Abraham, that Abraham believed God and that he believed that God could raise, how's it say that? I used to have this memorized. Yeah, could raise from the dead or call into existence the things that do not exist. And
Mm.
so again, it's a picture of Abraham. And when Abraham's offering up Isaac, he's got, out of obedience, he's got to trust God for two things. That God, because the promise is in Isaac. Do away with Isaac. There's no promise. Promise is in the son. The covenant promise in the son. And so that Abraham has to believe that God's going to either raise Isaac from the dead
Hmm.
or he's going to create something that doesn't exist.
Hmm.
And what does he do? He finds a ram in the thicket, something
Right.
that didn't exist. And so that in collaboration together, we're believing God to create something that doesn't exist. And so that I've got to surrender then my preferences and so on ahead of time. And not that those are all bad or wrong, but I'm not coming in to sell those or to make a situation where it lives out my preferences.
Hmm.
That together we're starting with this blank piece of paper and saying, Lord, we want to together create something that doesn't exist. To
Wow.
me, that's a true spirit of collaboration. And then again, that and so that the leader then in collaboration is they're kind of ruthless about the process. We're going to go through a process here to get to someplace, but I'm hands off on the outcome because we're trusting
Mm-hmm.
God what the outcome will be.
Wow.
So it doesn't mean there's not leadership given. The leadership is about the process, but
Yeah.
the leadership is saying, I've got my hands off on the outcome.
Yeah.
Because together we're believing God to create something that doesn't exist.
Bill, I've thought about that thought for decades. This idea, like, I need to be faithful in the process, but trust God for outcomes, not be so
Yeah.
wed to outcomes that I'm disappointed with God because He was going to make this successful. He was going to do. I mean,
Yes.
like, Lord, the outcomes are up to you. But I need to be faithful in the process.
Yes.
I'll do what I
Yes.
need to do. But you've
Yeah.
taken that, kind of applied that to this collaboration idea and leadership. I really love that.
Yeah. Well, I think most people don't like collaboration. Well, one is that it's one form of leadership. It's not the form of leadership. And I talk in the book about if certain conditions are present, then probably collaborative leadership is the best leadership that's needed.
Hmm.
So, like in the military, if we're taking this hill, I'm not going to ask a guy, well, guys, which way do you think,
Right. Let's all come together and
let's
right.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
we just need to go,
Right.
and
Right.
yeah, but there's some cases where we don't know what's the best thing to do, and let's think together about what's the best thing to do.
Yeah.
So that's collaborative leadership, and I think with most people see that as we never get anything done.
Right.
It's endless conversations. You know how that goes, and
Yeah. But
having
it's not.
one more committee meeting.
But I love what you're saying here. That look, this is part of the wisdom of leadership. There are times you say, guys, I know you may not understand why, you may not understand, how we got here, but we're taking that hill. Let's go.
That's right.
And you
Yes.
trust me, we just got to go. That's the one
Yes.
type of leadership. But it's
Yes.
not universal. It's not something you do in every
Yes.
situation.
Yes.
Sometimes you say it's not clear. Do we take this hill or that hill? And
Yeah.
then, in the abundance of counselors, there is wisdom. You say, let's, get the collective wisdom from the people that
Yeah.
you're leading. But the notion that is a little bit revolutionary to me here that I'm thinking that is news is you're creating something out of nothing. The collaboration that you said is like
Yeah.
creating something out of nothing. Because if you work for me, I'm a leader, and I say, well, Bill, what's your idea? And I say, that's nice, Bill, but we're not taking that today. We're taking Sally's idea because she's smart. We're taking her idea.
Yeah.
I'm just choosing those ideas from this different
Yes.
people. You give
Yes.
a suggestion
Yeah.
box, give me the ideas. Sally
Yes.
wins. We're going her way.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, you felt like you had some input, but you didn't work at it. But if the
Yeah.
collaboration is like creating a new entity out of something that wasn't there
Yeah.
before, thinking of it
Yeah.
that way that's really powerful, Bill. That's
Yeah.
very different.
Yeah, it is. And there's nothing wrong with the other approach as long as we're
At different
upfront
times.
about it, and to me, that's where cooperation and coordination come into play. But
Right.
collaboration to me is something a little bit different. And like, for example, I've got a responsibility in my local church of developing this ministry to seniors. Kind of one doesn't exist. And so to some degree, we're creating something out of, we don't
Yeah.
know what a good senior ministry looks like, but we're kind of creating one,
Yeah.
together as a team. And people aren't used to, I think sometimes in churches, Jim, what happens, and it happens in any organization, is that sometimes we end up treating people as employees and not partners.
Mm.
Sometimes, particularly in volunteer
Yeah.
organization. So we can say,
Oh
your
yeah.
job, Jim, is to make sure that the ushers are trained and they're greeting people every week. And so that's your job. So it's kind of like you're an employee,
Right.
but a partnership says, well, Jim, we want to create a welcoming atmosphere at our church. How do you think we can help our ushers create a welcoming atmosphere in our church? So
All
now
right.
you're a partner. So now
Right.
you're thinking with me and how we could create a welcoming atmosphere in our church. You're now a partner in it rather than I've assigned you a task to do. Now there's a place
Yes.
for assigned tasks, but I think particularly in the church too often we focus on the assigned task. And so people become employees rather than partners. And not an abusive way, but there's a subtlety there. And
Yeah.
not inviting them into the process to shape it together.
So
That's what
Bill,
I'm
let me
getting
let
at.
me let me go on a riff on this. It's not,
Yeah.
I don't think it's in your book. It's not in mine, but it's a thought I've had for a long time since I was practicing law in New York. And I've called it the line of inclusion.
Oh, okay.
And I
Okay.
think it's very much in tune with what you're saying. But I remember once I was with another associate at the law firm, and he came in my office and he was just like, his face was just falling, heartbroken. I said, "What happened?" He said, "They asked me to leave." I said, "What
Yeah.
do you mean?" He said, "I was been working on this deal for months. I've been working on this with doing other contracts and documents and merger agreements, all the rest. Finally got in this room where we're gonna hash it out and really negotiate this deal." And the senior partner looked at me and said, "What are you doing here?
Huh.
What are you doing here?" And asked me to step out of the room so they could
Yeah.
the big dogs, the part where they could negotiate
Yeah.
everything. And
Yeah.
and that one I thought it really struck me. And I've had many conversations since. I thought at that moment they could pay him double and he still wanted out.
Yes. Yeah.
He said, I've had it, I'm out.
Yeah.
And or the contrast is we say, hey, we've got this big decision to make and we're not sure which way to go. Bill, could you come in here a second?
Yes. Yes.
You come in the room and I could pay you half.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's
And
right.
the leadership thought, we're not sure which way to go. Bill, we really want to hear what you have to say about this.
Yes.
Come on in the
Yes.
room,
Yeah. Yeah.
collaborate with me.
Yes.
Let's work together
Yes.
on this.
Yeah.
That's being in the line of inclusion or not. And when you talked about treating people like employees, that's basically saying
Yeah.
that's below the line of inclusion. We, the leadership, we will make
Right.
decisions here. We may tell you why we're doing it. We may not. Your job as employee, you're below the line of inclusion.
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
execute. Just tell the
Yeah.
ushers what to do. You don't need to know why. You don't need
Yeah.
to understand.
Yeah.
Just get it done. Leave the thinking to us. That's below the
Yeah.
line of it. So that's my parlance.
Yeah. No, again, that's a great visual that I'm below the line of inclusion. And a lot of times, a lot of people are there. And in some ways, rightly so, certain circumstances
Right.
dictate that. And as they say, it's above my pay level. And okay,
Right.
some
And
of that.
by the way, some people do want to be below the line. It's like,
Yeah, yeah,
don't
that's
ask me.
right.
I
I
just
don't want to,
I
yeah.
work here.
Yeah, but to me, I think the bottom line issue is how do I respect you? And so that I tell you, well, Jim, we feel like these people are more skilled or in a position to perhaps better make this decision. You've given
Mhm.
us to this point. Now we need to move it on. See, so I'm
Yeah.
respecting you by communicating why I'm not including you in this meeting.
Right. Right.
And you may not agree, but at least it's been explained to you.
Yeah.
To me, that's what respect is. I take the time to explain it to you, and and you may not agree, but hey, a lot of times in life we don't agree with one another in a whole
Yeah.
variety of things. But at least I've respected you enough, and I think that's what often happens, whether it's in a church or any other organization or workplace. Showing that little sense of respect to people, and people respond to, okay, they respect me enough to explain it in person.
Yeah. Well, Bill, I tell you, I saw, that's why I love your book on the ways of the leader. I just saw very little leadership on Wall Street. But the people
Yeah.
are super type A. They went to the best schools, super bright, super accomplished. They're like great sole contributors. But I remember we moved back to the Midwest, and I remember watching like a little league coach. Another dad was coaching my kids, and the way he was gathering the kids together and explaining what to do. And Johnny, you go to second base, and this is what you're going to do, and all that. I thought this guy's got more leadership in his little pinky
Yeah.
than some of the partners I worked with that are making millions on Wall Street.
Yeah. Yeah. They're making all that money.
Yeah, but so they're you could, as long as you made money for other people, you can make a lot of money. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but not least of a
Yeah.
leader. But yeah. So sorry, I think I put the the story about the surrender in the wrong spot. It's a collaboration, not
Oh,
innovation.
that's okay.
The cultural wisdom. Let's talk about that for a minute, because that's at the
Yes.
lifelong learning, collaboration, cultural wisdom, and innovation. We talked about the others.
Yeah.
Talk about cultural wisdom, because I thought that was a good part of the book too.
Yes. Well, I'll give you an example, and you'd appreciate this, Jim, or anybody that started a new job. That with my wife Peggy, and I have permission to say this, and because she tells the story too, that she had taught in a Christian school for a number of years, and she decided, I think I just need a change. It's pretty safe in this setting, and I'm going to go out in the corporate world. And so she got a job in the corporate world, a Fortune 100 company. I won't tell you the company's name, but she got a job there as a field rep, uh, and so basically, when she walks into the building the first day to start training, she realizes I'm in a whole different culture here. In my Christian school, you had a culture of cooperation where, what's replaced that in a business setting, Jim? It's competition.
Yeah, that's right.
In the Christian school, you had a principal that was kind of on your side and was a bit of a nurturing individual. And now your management is only concerned about your bottom line numbers. How are you
That's
doing?
right. That's right.
And in the Christian school, a conversation for the most part was kind of edifying. You're encouraging one another, and you get here, and in this new culture, man, it's just profanity all over the place. And all she did was drive 10 minutes from home, and she's in another culture.
Yeah.
It's a workplace culture. And she realized that, again, I've got to figure this culture out. And there's subtleties to it. And there's some big issues in the culture. Because if I don't figure the culture out, one is I won't be able to do my job, that they've asked me to do. Two is I won't be able to connect with people around me. There's going to be this huge barrier between me and them. And three is I do want to influence this culture for the sake of the kingdom.
Yeah.
I'm not connecting and I'm not communicating. I have no influence in that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that I've got to understand the culture. I mean, you've been there, little things like, do I leave my desk to eat lunch? Or do I stay working? What's the expectations,
That's
here?
right.
When, I'm salaried, and does that mean that I work, more than 40 hours a week? And what's the expectations in the culture here?
Yep.
How do I treat the IT people? They could be the most important people you'll know.
Yeah. Yeah.
How
Well,
do I
yes.
treat them? Or how do I treat my, my fellow employees, because they could answer some questions that I don't know how to answer, and I need to be in a good relation, all those things. And so I have to understand my culture around me to see how can I connect with it, how can I communicate, and then hopefully how to influence it. So cultural wisdom is that, and I think of culture as it's kind of like a group of people hold in common, a common language, common values, a common history or story, and common practices.
Yeah.
So you think of the law firm you were once employed by, that, boy, obviously there's a whole legal jargon, you got a language,
Oh, yeah.
got certain values, and particularly a lot of times firms have certain values. And probably, the who the firm was named after, that's a story. There's a history there. And then you've got certain practices, and that creates that culture of that law firm. And another law firm, maybe two stories down from you in the same building, maybe have a very different culture.
Absolutely.
And so you need wisdom. And how do I understand this culture? So again, I can communicate, I can connect with people, and ultimately so that I can, hey, how can I have an influence for the kingdom? And so that being a cultural, what I call, then you need to then become, to gain cultural wisdom, I need to become, I call it a culture detective. I'm
Mhm.
looking for those clues, because what do detectives do? They look for clues, and by looking for clues, they're asking questions, they're making observations, and they're forming deductions. I'm forming
Mhm.
conclusions, but what I ask and what I observe, and I'm forming some deductions about this culture. And so that I become a cultural detective. And I train myself. Yeah, how do I observe, ask questions, make some deductions, and that gives me then cultural wisdom. So
Mhm.
that's a picture of it. And the way I look at it, Jim, is that there's a macro culture. That is, we talk about the dominant culture of the US. Oftentimes, that's the white Anglo-Saxon culture, as it were. or it
Mm.
could be the African American culture, the Italian culture, a
Mm.
gay culture. Sometimes those are macro cultures,
Hmm.
bigger groups of people. But then there's micro cultures, like you gave the example earlier in our conversation about your kids. You create a culture in your family. It's a little
Yeah.
micro culture. And that micro culture, there's certain practices and there's a language and values. And one of the values, okay, dad's going to quote from Proverbs again, and that's something, my kids wouldn't say that about me, but they say that about you. You and Deb have created this microculture, and
Yeah.
churches have microcultures within the larger dominant culture. Dominant culture could again be a northern culture versus a southern culture, or a blue state versus a red state culture,
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
rural versus urban.
Yeah.
And then within that, we have these microcultures, workplaces, neighborhoods, families, etc. But in
And,
each one, they have a culture.
and then you've had experience coming into different churches, right? And I think you wrote about that in some of the book. Like you come to different,
Yeah.
there are different cultures within those churches.
Oh, there's
But
huge different cultures.
discipleship principles, but the biblical principles
Oh,
are
yeah.
timeless, true.
Oh, oh,
Prin-
yeah.
But
Yeah.
how they're applied, yeah, I think you told a story about one guy walked in and said, "You can observe all you want, but understand like what do you I forget the word he said.
Yeah,
He was
he
talking
said,
about it, but like this is my church, right?"
yeah, this is my church. I
Right,
said, yeah. And okay, I know where
right.
I stand. I don't know if I shared in the book, but I've got a friend of mine who's a Lutheran pastor. I can't remember if I, so he took
I
us,
think you did mention.
he had a Sunday off, so he decided to go visit a large mega church down in Texas. He's got a Lutheran church in Texas, and he started to go to the neighboring mega church, Southern Baptist mega church.
Yeah,
And he says, "Man, what a culture experience!" I said, "Well, tell me
right.
about it." And he said, "Well, the first thing I walked in and I noticed nobody really greeted me, and so I go and sit down and he says, then I noticed, yeah, we kind of sang a couple of kind of singer kind of songs, and there's some announcements, and then there's a message, and I thought, yeah, sounds a lot like my church." And but he says, and everything's directed towards the platform. There's no interaction. And I said, well, I've been to your church. And so tell me, how's a Lutheran church different in terms of interaction?
Yeah.
He says, well, it's a lot different. He says, for one, we have responsive readings. And so there's a give and take between the pastor and the people.
Mm, mm, mm,
We have communion every Sunday. And we
mhm.
say that as a very much of a relational experience. People come forward to take communion, and it's ministered to people individually
There's a
rather than
verb.
you and I walking up, taking a little glass and walking back to our seats.
Oh, right, right, right. It's
They take
communal.
it. Well, you were right. Weren't you raised in a Lutheran church?
Right. And then there's responsive,
Yeah.
there's confession as well.
There's
So it's all,
confession.
we
There's
need the confession out loud.
yes, and
Um,
there's passing of the peace, which I always used to think is kind of corny, but when you understand the background of it, you realize there's a whole significance to this. So that when he explained it, you realize there's a lot of interactive things taking place here. And that's different from the Southern Baptist culture where it's all directed from the platform.
yeah,
Everything's coming from the platform.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
cultural experience,
right.
you
And he, as an
know,
outsider, he
as
was
an
not,
outsider.
he was
Yeah,
able to go
coming
see
in.
it and
Yeah,
observe it.
yeah.
A
And
little bit
just
like
in
that.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
And so how do we understand then that, particularly as we think about, advancing the gospel and making disciples, that's what missionaries face
yeah,
overseas.
right.
Well, we face similar issues here in the US. And for example, let me the verse I quote in oh, I don't have a Bible right here handy. Um it's in Proverbs, I forget where it is now, but Proverbs says that um when you shout a loud blessing in the morning loudly to your neighbor, it'll be counted as a curse.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah,
And so that again, it's a good thing. I'm shouting this blessing, but I'm shouting it early in the morning, and my neighbor takes it as a curse because I've woken him up, and so
right.
it's a good message. I'm going to bless my neighbor, but it's done in inappropriate ways and at inappropriate times.
Hmm.
Sometimes, if we don't understand our culture, our message, which is good, will be shared in inappropriate ways and inappropriate times,
Yeah,
and it'll be counted as a curse and not a blessing. And so that's, in a bottom shell, we talk about contextualization, variety of issues, but just a simple level like that, we can figure out what takes place on a college campus, for example.
Mhm.
Evangelism is a whole lot different than what happens in your neighborhood
Yeah.
because it's a
Yeah.
different context, a different culture.
It's funny, Bill. I'm just is thinking of this now as you're describing it. You're thinking about, hey, how do I, as a leader, as a Christian, understand that culture,
Yes.
be able to adapt to it, work within it, to be effective within it for the Lord? That's the contrast is a culture wars where I
Yeah.
say, I just hate that other culture.
Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
burn it to the ground. I want to
Yeah.
defeat it. I
Yeah.
want to own it, right? Or
Yeah.
I want to crush it. I want to fight against it. I don't want to be part of it, or I
Yeah.
want to remove myself from it. I want to
Yes.
draw into my own safe subculture and
Yeah.
not engage
Yeah.
with it at all because I don't like it.
Yeah.
What you're talking about is really radical that way, very different. Saying no, wisdom.
Well,
You tell me how you see it that way.
yeah, well, the other side is that there are things about cultures that are evil.
Yeah. Well,
There are things
yes.
about our culture that's evil,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And so I don't want to adopt the evil things in a culture or to either embrace or to condone those, but most of the time the issues are usually preferences. That's what I've heard when you talk with veteran missionaries overseas, they tell me this is, well, I just need to keep repeating to myself, it's not wrong, it's just different.
Yeah.
It's not wrong, it's just different.
Unless it is wrong. You
Yeah,
say
there can be
in our
cases where
culture,
it is
we
wrong.
murder
Yes.
people. Well, that's
Yes.
wrong. We
Yeah.
run. Yeah.
Well, like for example, we just got back from Africa, and I noticed that meetings didn't start on time like they do here in the U.S.
I've heard. Yeah.
Then I remembered a book I'd read on time.
Yeah.
There are different cultural perspectives on time, particularly Latin culture, African culture. The highest value is that we won't get started until Jim shows up. I
Hmm.
value Jim. I
Hmm.
want him to hear what's going to take place with this speaker. So we're not going to start until Jim shows up because I
Hmm.
value you. So
Hmm.
meetings start when everybody shows up because the
Hmm.
highest value is I want everybody to be able to learn, not that we start on time.
Hmm.
In Western culture, the highest value is we start on time.
Punctuality. That's right.
And yeah, and we feel like, boy, that's showing disrespect to somebody by you're not starting on time. Well, other cultures, the disrespect is that I'm not valuing you as a person. We're just running over you because of the sake of the schedule. And
Yeah.
so which one is right? Okay, well, there's arguments to both sides here.
Sure.
And so I've got to understand that in a culture, so I'm not judging that culture, and I just have to adapt to it
Right.
because I'm not going to change it. You
Well,
know,
and you can learn from it too. You say you can observe.
exactly.
It's like the problem. Observe and find wisdom. Right. Say, oh, sometimes I had unassumed rules in my own culture, unexamined. I never thought about that, but now that
Yes.
I see it in another culture,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
I just saw, not to promote something else, but just a YouTuber who was living in a foreign country saying, now that I'm in a foreign country, this is like the missionary example, although they were missionaries,
Yeah.
saying, and now I observe these things about American culture that I just took for granted. I just assumed
Yes.
it's the way it was, that everyone does this. And now that I'm in a different culture, I suddenly have this awareness like, oh, not everyone thinks this way.
I know.
Not life isn't. And they said things like and these are not Christians. Like, I just thought life is all about materialism, get a bigger house, better car.
Yeah.
I realize, oh, there's relationships. There's more to life than that. And,
Yes.
anyway, again, it's kind of observing and finding wisdom and
Yes. Yes.
going across cultures. But I like that. It's not just a culture war. And I appreciate the wisdom of saying sometimes it is a culture war. Sometimes you say, no, I got to
Yeah.
fight against this thing that is just wrong.
Yes.
Also saying if it's not, it's just a preference. Understand it, work within it. You know, again, I could tell you, Bill, when we moved to New York City, I remember talking about the Christian side. You're crazy. That place is just godforsaken, awful place.
Yeah.
Who would want to go to New York City? And we ended up loving it, loving the city, loving the people, and being
Yeah.
there, and feeling like, and not in found one of the best church, just a wonderful church, right?
Yeah.
Tim Keller's Redeemer Presbyterian. So spiritually, we just, I think, grew by leaps and bounds. It's not,
But that's the story, Keller, right? He loved the city.
yeah, and I think
Adapted.
very much so. It was, and a lot of his ministry was, Hope for New York was very much about the city.
Yeah, and he adapted his ministry to the city,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
without compromising, but he developed ministry forms that connected with the city.
Right.
without
Right.
compromising the message.
Right. By the way, just little detail, not that it's just an offbeat detail, because I mentioned that you were talking about the Lutheran format of responsive readings and that engagement. uh Keller's church was a Presbyterian church, but we did confessions there as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
in the Lutheran church I grew up in, we did the same confession every week, and I memorized it. I might give it some time be able to draw it out of memory even now,
sure.
because we did it as a kid. You just said it again and again and again, you know. But at Keller's church, they were new every time, and they were deep, and they were so convicting. I remember one guy said, "I'm not sure I can keep coming here because the confessions are so convicting. They're
Yeah,
so
yeah,
deep." And then he had to read this out loud. I have not, Lord, I have not thought about the poor, and I thought about
yeah,
my own interests more than others. And he's thinking here, and but he was onto something, and that the depth of understanding your own sin is, well, you're going to really appreciate what the Lord
yes,
has done for you. So,
yeah.
um, hey, before I leave it, I want to, and we'll wrap up here in a minute, but I don't want to leave without talking about this one other illustration you had. It was a triangle about asking questions.
Oh, okay.
I loved it. And you had the three sides were timing, type, and trust. And I don't know if you just, I don't want to, I mean, is there any thoughts you had
Sure,
on that at all? Because I really
sure.
like that section. I like this rubric for thinking about how to ask good
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, again, if you picture in your mind a triangle, you get the three sides, and I think there's the technical side. What is the triangle? It's got three equal sides. Is that an isosceles triangle?
No, that's
I
two.
forget. What's the three
I,
equal sides?
I don't know. We're both so far from grade school
I got
geometry. I can't,
I got
I'll
I
have to
got
Google
C's
it.
in geometry in high school. But anyhow, if you picture a triangle that has three equal sides,
Okay.
maybe
Equilateral? Is that it? No, wait. Well, I'll Google it.
no, that's but anyhow, the bottom side is of the triangle is, it communicates what's critical for asking good questions is the issue of trust.
Yes.
So that, what I've seen time after time, the greater the trust, the more personal the question I can ask. And so that you as the person engaged in the conversation, if I'm asking you questions, if you trust me, you can be honest with me. If you don't trust me, if you're wondering what's he going to do with this information,
Right.
why is he asking me that question?
Right. So use it against me.
You use it against me. But the greater the trust, the more personal the question. And so that in asking questions, we need to have trust with people. Then the second equal side is type of question. And this struck me, Jim, and I way back when I was at Ohio State, doing my graduate work and my writing my graduate thesis was on. It's a big title, but it was the philosophy and practice of adult educators in evangelical churches.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, what's the philosophy and practice of Sunday school teachers, seminar leaders in our churches? Okay.
Yeah.
So I visited, I don't know how many Sunday school classes, workshops, seminars, of different churches. And I wrote down every question that was asked. That was one of the things I did.
That the
And then at the
teachers were
end of,
asking, or that the
yeah, the
students were?
teachers asked. No, that the
Oh,
teachers asked.
okay.
Okay. And at the end of the time, I had a couple of hundred questions that I'd written down. And then I did an analysis of those questions. And I discovered there was two primary questions that were asked. One question is, particularly, again, these are evangelical churches, so that a lot of the questions were what is it, let's see, what do you observe about the text, okay, the Bible, and then how can you apply it?
Hmm.
Now, again, those are two good questions. What do you observe? That's a good question. How can you apply? That's a good question. But what's missing? There's nothing in between that, in the sense that encourages deeper thinking, deeper
Hmm.
reflection about either the text or about life, or, why do you think the author said it this way? What theme do you think the author's exploring that is the most prominent theme in the book? If boy, what's he not addressing that you have questions on?
Right.
Saying those kinds of questions are different than what do you observe and how can you apply?
Yeah.
So you get different types of questions that you want to ask. And by the way, you can give a plug here. If you want to go to my website, alongsider.com, under resources, I've got what's called a question ladder. And it gives you different types of questions that you can ask, kind of as you climb this ladder, you might say. And so there's different types of questions that we need to ask. And the third side of that triangle is timing. And so that, like a lot of times, my Peggy would get on me. We've got guests over, and as people are going out the door, I ask them one last question. Peggy says, "Why are you asking that question? They're getting ready to leave."
Yeah.
Well, my
Right.
timing's not good. But all of us have probably had somebody ask us a question and we realize, wow, this is a Holy Spirit moment. This is an important question. I never thought about this question before. Or yeah. And so, timing that's that Holy Spirit moment when we're trusting God to ask the right question, because that captures our attention, that forces us to think, whatever it might be, or to
Yeah.
act or to change. And so good questions is kind of trusting the Holy Spirit, again, to build trust in people's lives, to ask different types of questions, and then to trust him for the timing of when to ask some questions. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
just helped me to, as we think about asking questions, kind of those, excuse me, three qualities help me be a better question asker.
I love it. I love it. That's really good. And I think about the timing as well, because sometimes, I can ask a question at just the wrong time. I think and that's just part of wisdom, right?
Yeah,
Understanding that.
yeah.
Um, that's great, Bill. So we should probably, just as we wrap up, anything else from the book that we haven't covered, you thought, and then like a major thrust of the book or something, a major takeaway, um, or if you want to talk about just how it's been received, how you see it, other people react to the book, I think is another. Uh,
Yeah, good question. Sometimes as an author, it's hard a lot of times you put books out there and you have no idea how it's being used because you don't get immediate feedback. In other words, if I got a small group of people and we're talking about the book together, then okay, I can see the feedback. But I think
mhm.
that's one of the challenges in writing is you get something out there, you're just not sure how it's being received and whether people have questions. I think that's a skill in writing, I find, is that how can I make sure that it's clear enough that no matter who's reading it out there, that they could grasp what I'm trying to say. There's not an obscurity about it. And to me, that's part of the craft of writing is that a lot of times I'm writing to a skeptic,
Mm.
somebody that's going to debate with me.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so how do I write in a way to kind of communicate what I'm saying? By the way, when I took a philosophy class in graduate school, there was only two things I remember from the class, and one of them was he said, "Good philosophy always justifies and clarifies." And I thought that's how we write. We want to justify our main points, and we want to clarify what we're saying, make sure it's clear. We
Right.
justify, and probably the same thing in legal speak. You want to
Yeah.
justify and
But
clarify.
you're also anticipating objections
Yes,
and
yes,
answering those. So your part of your clarification is,
yes,
I'm thinking, well, I know what you're going to be asking. As I say this, I know
yes,
what you're going to be, you're objecting to, or how you're going to object. And let me address that
yes.
up front.
Yes, and so what I'm saying is that not to cop out of your question, but sometimes it's hard to know. You hear secondhand how people are using the book.
Yeah.
So again, I don't want to turn it into an infomercial, but it has been received well by people. And I think if I had to say one last thing, is that in the last chapter I talk about the choices that we face, and really it's the choices about wisdom. And in one chapter, one section of the chapter says, I choose the chase over passivity. And I
Yeah. I
start
remember
out
that.
with the example of my dog, and my dog Ginger is a coon hound. And so when we let her outside in the early morning, first thing she does, she pauses on the step. And so as a coon hound, she's smelling and observing the yard. And a lot of times you'll see a squirrel and you see her pause, and then she chases that squirrel, but she never catches it. And she's treed the squirrel like a good coonhound dog. And but boy, she just, from that crouching position, she's taken off. And I think that's like us, that we just need to be people who are chasing after wisdom. And that
Mm.
passage in Proverbs 2, and I quote it here, if you call out for insight, raise your voice for understanding, seek it like silver, search for it as a hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and
Yeah.
you'll find wisdom. And so that we can't be passive about this, that we're pursuing wisdom and this requires effort on our part. And it demands me, this is what's interesting, it demands me to think, that there's this passage in Proverbs 1 right in the beginning, he talks about to his son, and he says that, and I want you to choose wisdom, and he refers to it as a riddle. And to understand the riddles, and I don't know about you, but we don't use riddles much anymore. But I hate riddles. And one
Hmm.
of the reasons I hate them is it forces me to think. And sometimes I don't like to think. It's hard work. And
Hmm.
so chasing after God's wisdom means that I've got to stop. And like you were saying earlier, I got to linger. I've got
Hmm.
to pause. I've got to think. I've
Hmm.
got to pay attention. Particularly, I got to wrestle with the text in this case. And that takes work. And it's easy to pass it over and not put the effort into it, not to chase after it.
Yeah.
And so that's, I guess, to end it is that that we want to chase after and capture God's wisdom, that we catch wisdom when we make the effort, take time to think, and experience a fruit of discernment. And so we need to move from passivity to this attitude of a chase. We're seeking it like silver, searching for it as for hidden treasure.
I
So
love
I
it,
guess
Bill.
I'll close it with kind of that thought.
That's great. I'll just reflect on that and we'll wrap up. But I don't know if I ever told you this, Bill, but when I accepted Christ at the age of 14, I grew up in a Christian home. I think I was believed in Jesus all that time, but really at age 14 said, I want to give my life to Christ completely. And I think right in that, my 14th year, maybe I was 15, I remember reading Proverbs straight through. I remember where I was sitting in the back deck of the house and we're just going to read. And I think, I don't know if I made it all the way through, but maybe 20 some chapters. I remember thinking like, wow, pursue wisdom. Like the most important value you can have in life is pursuing wisdom. Not that I've done any of it, Bill.
Yeah.
Not one shred of it, but the value of it to say. And that's why I remember when I was reading your book and came to this chapter, this section, choosing to chase over passivity. And that verse from Proverbs 2, that that being zealous for wisdom, being eager to get wisdom, and God recognizing that, rewarding it, just made me think of that episode of
Yeah.
my own life. So I really appreciate it.
Well, again, in context, the writer of it is directing it to his sons.
Mm.
And so it's for his sons. And again, people that are important to us, how can we influence them so that they're pursuing wisdom like this? And again, that's the context. How are we influencing, challenging others to pursue, the fear of God, which is the beginning of all wisdom?
The book is called The Ways of the Leader by Bill Mowry. Bill, it's been such a pleasure having you on. Really appreciate
Well,
the podcast.
thank you, Jim. Yeah, well, it's been fun talking with you on this.
Always great to talk to you, Bill.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Jim.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.